See, there I am. Let me try that again. Thank you. Appreciate that. Well, good morning. It's so good to be with you. I love coming to Compass Church. I love the congregation, all of you, who you are, your history, your traditions, your strengths. And so I very much appreciate the invitation extended by Dr. Sybrandt, Troy, and also all of you to return and share God's Word with you yet again. This morning, I know that all of you are aware that October is Pastor's Appreciation Month. Yes? Yeah. So would it be too much for me to ask that all of you that are gathered here in the sanctuary write Pastor Troy, each one of you, a note sometime this week? Yes? Personalize it. Let him and his family, Amy and Abby, let them know what they mean to you. That's so very important through the congregations that I've pastored through the years. Some congregations have been better about being aware of Pastor's Appreciation Month than some other congregations. And pastors need encouragement. They sure do. It's difficult work, and it requires a great sacrifice. And I know Troy, and I know that he's making that sacrifice for you. And he is an absolutely wonderful pastor. Yes, he is. Yes. He's caring, he's diligent, he's hardworking, he's thoughtful, he's a people person, and so you have so much to be thankful for in the qualities that you have in him as a pastor. But, having been a pastor myself, I know that congregational life also impacts the family. And so don't forget to include Amy and Abby in your thoughts and in your sentiments as you encourage them throughout the month of October. Yes? Does that sound fair enough to challenge you in that kind of way this morning? Well, today, and I have to digress for a moment to say how much I love that children's sermon. That was spot on. That really was. And every time I come to Compass Church and I pass along my sermon title and my texts for that particular Sunday, there's always a children's message that relates back to the scriptures that we're going to share in. And I thought it was wonderful. It's if you forget everything that I'm going to say this morning, just hang on to that children's message because it was wonderful and it was powerful. And there's a lot within that children's message to take away with you as you walk and journey with the Lord this week. Well, my message for today is entitled, Retire from All Humankind. Kind of an interesting phrase. Well, you know, and I know, especially from our prayer requests that were mentioned this morning, that there's lots of conversation going on in the United States right now about the Constitution, right? And I'm not talking about the SS Constitution that's moored in Boston Harbor. I'm talking about the actual Constitution of the United States, right? What does it say? What bearing does it have upon our lives? How can we apply it? What did the original founding fathers mean when they suggested certain nuances? And so lots of conversation about the Constitution. Well, there was a man that lived in and around the time of the Constitution, a little bit before that period, but, generally speaking, the same season of history within the United States, and his name was Jonathan Edwards. And he was a very, very famous American revivalist. He was a preacher. He was a philosopher, and he was a congregational theologian, and he was a pastor. So go ahead and read up and study on the life of Jonathan Edwards. Again, the Revolutionary War preachers were very, very prolific. Most of us, when we come to church on a Sunday, we reasonably expect a sermon or a message that will go 20 minutes, half an hour. These guys would preach for hours, okay? I mean, you brought your lunch, you brought your picnic basket, and you just, soaked it all in, God's Word, for hours on end. And Edwards is widely regarded as one of America's most important and original philosophical thinkers. Edwards' theological work, it's broad in scope, but it was rooted in Reformed theology, the metaphysics of theological determinism, which is a shorthand, a way of saying that everything that happens to you in your life, God has intended, or God allows, or God foresees into the future that those things are going to happen. And so he really brought about the best of Puritan heritage. He lived, again, just before that Revolutionary War period, the antecedents of it. And Edwards played a critical role in shaping what was called the First Great Awakening in the United States. That's when everyone got out of bed during the 1700s and they found God. And it was a wonderful thing that happened within our nation. And so he oversaw some of the first revivals in the United States in that period, 1733, 1735, from the church that he pastored in Northampton, Massachusetts. Now, among being a voice for the church, Edwards also advocated that every Christian must prioritize and create seasons to be alone with God and to hear from Him and respond in prayer. And that's why I love the children's message this morning ever so much, yes? Listening to God. Now, here's how Edwards captured that some 250 years ago. He writes the following: "A true Christian, doubtless, delights in religious fellowship," such as what I beheld here this morning, all of you delighting in fellowship, "and Christian conversation, and finds much to affect his heart in it, but he also delights at times to," here it is, "retire from all mankind." Yes? "To converse with God in solitary places," and this also has its peculiar advantages for fixing his heart and engaging his affections, yes, as we retire from mankind. "True religion disposes persons to be much alone in solitary places for holy meditation and prayer." So that's Edwards' advice and encouragement for us. And although Edwards was a genius thinker and on the cutting edge of religion and culture for his time, the idea of retiring from all mankind was one that emerges from the Bible itself, particularly from the life of Jesus himself. You heard the scriptures shared with you this morning. "And after Jesus had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain to pray. When evening came, he was there," how? "Alone. In the morning, while it was still very dark." I don't know if, how many of you are morning persons? I'm not a morning person at all. A 10:30 start to worship time is just about right for me. Some people are morning persons, The text is telling us Jesus was a morning person, yeah? In the morning, while it was still yet dark, before we had turned the clocks back for daylight savings time, he got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he did what? He prayed, yes? And then lastly, from Luke's gospel, "Now, during those days he went out to a mountain to pray, and he spent the night in prayer." So that tells me he got up really early in the morning, so he was a morning kind of guy, And he spent the night in prayer. That tells me that after the evening news, Jesus went up to the mountain. He got on his knees after he had finished watching Dave Letterman. Oh, excuse me, I'm dating myself there. He carried on all through the night in prayer. So there we have the proof that Jesus himself felt that retiring from mankind was not optional for his followers, but absolutely necessary. But do we practice retiring from mankind as Jesus did, and how might our lives change if we intentionally sought out solitary places, as Jonathan Edwards calls them, to get alone with God, to restore balance, receive instruction, and be filled with God's Spirit? What if? Yeah? Now, the reason that I desperately wanted to share this message with you is because this generation, we are the early inhabitants of the 21st century, are the most bombarded generation of all generations with competing or contradictory messages attached to it. And our solitary places are successfully being squeezed out of our lives. I mean, did you ever feel that you can't think straight anymore because you have so many people trying to advise, influence, and recommend to you how you should live your life? Yeah? Well, if you haven't, then I must be alone in that. Yeah? It is truly overload. Yeah? And I can remember watching electronic billboards in sci-fi movies when I was a kid, you know. Now they're reality, yeah? A massive distraction as you drive up and down the highway. And Google, they are experts in what we call suggestive advertising or targeted advertising, yes? Well, last summer, my family and I, we went on a wonderful vacation out west. We wanted to hike what's called the Mighty Five. These are national parks throughout Utah, Colorado. We'd never done anything like that before. Absolutely beautiful, and we would certainly do it again. But as my wife and I were planning for this vacation, and we have our laptop open, and we're looking at where we want to stay, where we want to go, what we want to do. All the while, my laptop is talking to me and saying, "But don't you want to stay in this hotel? Don't you want to go and visit this particular site? No, I don't want to go see that particular site. Well, don't you want to rent this car? Look at this beautiful car." You know, constantly making suggestive ideas. So, where is this going? If it's not already here, the future holds a time where mathematical algorithms are going to make selections for you. As I said, if they're not already, yeah? So the Christian must be very, very aware when someone or some IT influence says, "Let me select that for you." Because they may not have your best interests at heart. They may have their own best interests at heart. Well, I love Tom Cruise as an actor. You know, I'm a Tom Cruise devotee. You know, I can only take so many chick flicks, and then I say to my wife, you know, I got to have some action adventure here, darling, you know. And I usually find myself a Tom Cruise movie. Well, I love that 2002 futuristic Tom Cruise movie. It's called Minority Report. And there's a scene in that movie where Tom Cruise, he's walking through a shopping mall. And as he's walking through this shopping mall, all the stores that he's walking past, you've seen storefront windows. Well, they all have like these screens in these storefront stores, in the windows, if you will. And these screens turn to Tom Cruise as he's walking along this mall. And each one of them addresses him as his character. And they invite him. Don't you want to come into the store and buy such and such? Just as he's walking through the mall. So you can imagine yourself walking through a mall, and all the advertising is geared for you. Yeah? So my argument against all this selective advertising is that the process of my own choice has been removed from the equation. A little bit of me has been removed, and that's what this world does. It keeps taking a little bit of you until there is none of you that is left. Or the world thinks it can do it better than you, and so it takes pieces of you and it replaces them with things that they think are best, rather than you making the decision-making that you feel is important for your life. Now, in hospice, I have been here now with you several times so that you'll know I'm a hospice chaplain. In hospice, toward the end of life, there can be a life crisis that we call decision-making. And as chaplains, we're at the bedside of these patients, and we assist and support them in their decision-making. And decision-making means that you're involved in your life, and that you'd be surprised at how many people are not, and you'd be surprised at how our younger generation is deferring decision-making to their electronic devices. How sad to get to the end of life and not know who you are or what you want or why. And how sad it is to be a young person and not know how to make a decision. Wow, I'm of the mind to say that they need to teach decision-making in schools today, you know? Not because, not to like pass off a curriculum, but to teach that skill, you know, how to make a decision. So here's the point. When Jesus is retiring from all mankind or humankind, he is not letting someone make his decisions to determine his destiny for him. It's what we call in hospice care autonomy. In other words, you're able to do it for yourself. And Jesus is the one who draws apart autonomously from all the clamor and contradictions of this life. He is the one who falls to his knees because he doesn't want to cut his Father out of the equation of his life or defer his decision-making to a board or a panel of opinionated disciples. Yeah? As I get older, one of the things I've discovered, and maybe it's just me, is that people do opinionated real well. Have you ever found that to be the case? You know, I tell you what, you don't even want somebody's opinion, and they're giving you an opinion, I'll tell you what. And that's why I like within the communion liturgy, or at least one of the communion liturgies that I use, and I know that you're journeying into what it means to have an open table, yes? I love that liturgy that says, come not to express an opinion, but to seek his presence. Because you're going to get more from his presence than you ever are from your opinion. Our opinions are limited, they're subjective, but his presence fills our hearts and our lives with things that we never ever could have imagined. So here's how the world works in the 21st century. If you aren't autonomous, if you can't make a decision for yourself, somebody else is going to make that decision for you. That's just the way that things work now. Somebody else is going to make it for you. Even spiritually, there are plenty of people out there that are happy to assist you, and I'm being polite, to tell you how you should live for God rather than you or I having to put the work in to get on our knees and get alone with God so that we can hear him speak. Because if we're not doing that, somebody else is going to fill that void. A few months back, I was taking our dog for a walk in the neighborhood, and I noticed this flatbed truck, and it showed up at the house just a few doors down from where we live. And this flatbed truck, it had this beautiful new royal blue Nissan Maxima. It was beautiful. Now, I drive a car that's over 10 years old, okay? So anything it could have been 2 or 3 years old, and I would have loved it, you know? It caught my eye. It was just that beautiful. And the driver alighted out of the vehicle of this flatbed truck, and he offloaded this beautiful blue Nissan Maxima into this person's driveway. And on the side of that truck, it said, Carvana. Carvana, however you pronounce that, yeah? Now, call me old school, but I like to smell and touch and feel and hear the car that I'm going to buy. I like to open the door. I like to sit in the seat. I like to grab the steering wheel. I like to look at the console. And I like to go, And I engage in decision making. Is this something that I would like? Yeah? So I just struggle because the next generation, and they're obviously here right now, they seemingly don't need to smell or feel or taste or touch. And that's pretty shocking. At least it is to me. As I said, I'm old school. I know, I'm a dinosaur, right? I'm passing away. All they need to do is point and click. And this wonderful, beautiful car appears in the driveway, you know? It's like I Dream of Jeannie or something like that. I don't know, you know? But by God, and here's my bias, what hollow human beings we are becoming in the process. So here's what I believe. Retiring from mankind, or the process of life, it provides your life with depth and substance. When Jesus condemned the Pharisees for refusing to immediately retrieve a stranded ox that was down in the hole in Luke chapter 14 on the Sabbath day, he condemned them for having a religion that was more concerned about blind obedience than emotional process. I think Jesus was standing there saying, "What is the matter with you people? That when you see someone in need, be it your son or be it an ox that falls in, what's the matter with you?" Yeah, just absolutely amazing. Remember Jonathan Edwards' advice? Engage your affections. Don't let your laptop do it for you. Yeah? You see, rote religion always guts your heart. It always does. Rote religion kills the heart. And Jesus condemned these Pharisees because they peddled a religion without any feelings. And if God is living, you've got to be able to feel Him and sense Him and experience Him. That's what the revivalists in the formation of this great nation were all about. When they preach about experiencing God. Not necessarily as a rational cognitive idea, but experience Him such that when you left that revival tent, your life had been changed, not by the preacher, but by the living God, yes? Now, as a pastor for about 30 years, I have probably married about 3 couples that met on the internet, you know, what you would call online dating, right? Which I have absolutely no advice to give you, any advice to give you about that at all. But this I do know to be true. It don't matter what kind of profile you create, or how you choose to airbrush your cheeks, or how big you choose to make your biceps on your profile to enhance your image, yes? And how can you enhance your image when you have been given the best image of all? Because Scripture back in the book of Genesis calls the image that resides within you the imago Dei, the image of God. And you can't get any better image than that, no matter how you doctor your profile, yeah? Now, eventually, despite all the shape-shifting and padding of your personality, right, for online dating, you're going to have to meet, right? Oh, it's looking good. Okay, when do we meet? Do you mean face to face? You're going to have to look into that person's eyes. You're going to have to listen to their voice. You're going to have to smell her hair. And she's going to have to feel your grip. All of this is called process. The process. In other words, retiring from all mankind is expressly for the purpose of engaging life fully, completely, with determination, vigor, and hope. People get hope when they're with each other. Just about every single patient that I see in hospice, when I write up my chart notes, I say the following: chaplain engaged in a ministry of presence. Chaplain engaged in a ministry of presence. You have to be present with other people. Yeah? That's what Jesus did, didn't he? When you read the Gospels, wasn't he always fully engaged in life? Without processing life, only alienation from self and others remains. This is the term that we use in hospice. It refers to a person who arrives at the end of their life and they don't know who they are. And you know what? Off script, if I haven't done that enough already this morning, but off script, the older I get, that is one of my prayers that's on my knees. I will pray, God, before I breathe my last breath, help me to know who I am. Help me to know who I am. Help me to know what I mean to others. Yeah? And while it's true that people can be alienated from themselves and others, systems can alienate us too. Here's a photograph of one of the greatest women that ever impacted my life. Her name is Mary Butterwick, and she started the first hospice in the northeast of England. And I'll give you a little backstory. Mary's passed away now, but she helped to train me in hospice care. Yeah? And part of her motivation for building the hospice, the first in the northeast of England that she did. Now let me tell you, because you're seeing a beautiful woman here and you're seeing a beautiful smile. When God gave to Mary Butterwick the vision to build the very first hospice in the northeast of England, and she told me this story herself personally. She said, Daniel, and I can't exactly copy her accent, but she said, Daniel, I was just absolutely persuaded that this is what God wanted me to do. And she said, so I went out and I approached the bricklayers. And I said to the bricklayers, I said, you're going to build me a hospice, aren't you? And they said, yes, we're going to do that, Mary. And then she would approach the carpenters. And she would say, God, she would, so bold, it was like Acts chapter 10. She would approach the carpenters and she said, God has sent me to you and you're going to build the roof for my hospice, aren't you? Now, can you say no to this beautiful face here? Can you? Now, let me tell you, Mary had this huge presence because she was connected with people. Yeah? And she had this huge sense of persuasiveness. But she absolutely believed that what God was asking her to do, and she would say to me, Daniel, it was up to me to go and ask. That was my part in obedience. But Mary was a part of a system. And her backstory, I have it here in her book. Her husband, John, died from a brain tumor. Yeah? And she brought him into the hospital. And so she writes these words when he passed. And this was also part of her motivation for starting this hospice. She says, there were so many unanswered questions in relation to his death. Why did no one tell her John, her husband, was dying? Surely they must have known. Why did she not see it herself? Had he known her husband and not told her? Why were they robbed of their last farewell? Why did they not have time to say, I love you? Why was there no compassion from the hospital staff? Why did they let him fall in the hospital so many times? Why did they rob him of his dignity? Why did that, we call nurses in Great Britain, we call them sisters, okay? Why did that sister tell her to go home and forget him? That's what the nurse said. Go home, Mrs. Butterwick. Forget your husband. Maybe physically and medically she did care for John, the nurse, but why couldn't she have been more careful with her words? Words can wound too. Why did the same nurse refuse to let her in with the vicar when he went to give John a final blessing? This was absolutely amazing in her story, because her husband was on his deathbed and the nurse called for the vicar or the priest or the minister, and Mary begged him, I want to go with you. And he got right on the phone to the hospital, called the nursing staff and said, I'm coming in to bless Mr. Butterwick. Mrs. Butterwick wants to come too. And the nursing staff said no. So the vicar went and she went home. Was a rule worth more than a life? She never saw John alive again after that. Why did he die alone? Surely people should care for each other better than that. Where is the care, God, she asked. I know I keep asking, but I don't see it anymore. Where are you, God? Where has the love gone? That's a little bit about where her heart was at before she began that very first hospice in Great Britain. So systems can push us to the edge, to the fringes, and that's precisely where Jesus went. Jesus, you see, had this habit of moving away from all the entrapments and distractions of this life to the fringes, because where the quiet and solitude is on the fringes. So do you and I journey there? Do we journey to the quiet fringes, you see? When you get to the edge, like the people of Israel did in the Exodus narrative, there are only three choices. And if you've watched the Cecil B. DeMille's, that wonderful movie, The Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, you can remember that scene where the people of Israel are pressed up against the very edge of the Red Sea in Exodus chapter 13, yes? And there's only three choices at that point. You can die at the hands of someone else, the aggressor, the Egyptians. You can die by drowning, or you can see the salvation of our God. And the first two choices are the choices of those who have lost their way. God has abandoned me and all hope is lost. But the third choice is this: even at the fringe, with your back pushed up against the Red Sea, with nowhere else to go, even at the edge of your life, you can hear God's voice and you can witness His salvation at work. When Jesus was drawing apart, when He was retiring from all humanity, He was not only getting rid of all the distractions, the clamor, but He was saving us from all the noisy forces that seek to destroy your soul. And that's the time that we live in. Listen to the text from Isaiah again. For thus saith the Lord God, the Holy One of Israel, in returning and rest you shall be saved, in quietness and trust shall be your strength. In the aloneness, not loneliness, what is Jesus doing in prayer? He is processing the context of His life with the content of God. Yeah? And all of us have this context in life. And I've shared a little bit through my visits with you here at Compass Church about the context of my life. We all have a context in life. We have a magnet on our refrigerator in our kitchen at home that reads, "Home is where your story begins." Home is where your story begins. It's what the German theologians call Sitz im Leben, the situation in life. We all come from somewhere and are connected to someone, what we call in hospice care, life review. Yeah, life review. So I was visiting with this patient. He was in a locked memory unit. And what that means is you can't get in unless you know the code. And you can't get out unless you know the code. So I was visiting with this patient, and he was sitting at the table like this. Yes? And I engaged this gentleman. And as I was talking with him, I could hear that he had a bit of an accent. And one of the nurses came along and said, "Oh yes, this gentleman, he's from Germany. And let's call him Franz, if you will, Franz." Now, Franz was a dementia patient, and I heard this accent. And so, with my background, I started to engage him in the German language. "Franz, was machen Sie jetzt? Wie geht es Ihnen? Bist du gut? Bist du ganz gut?" And one of the nurses, they heard this conversation going back and forth in German, and she says, "I've got an idea," because Franz had this, you know the picture books that you make of your beloved family at Christmas time through Shutterfly? Well, they had one of those for Franz, and the nurse ran and she retrieved it from his room, and she brought it out to the table where Franz and I were in conversation. Now, he's a dementia patient, which essentially means, depending upon the stage, he had forgotten half of his life. And so I opened that picture book. It was produced by his niece and his nephew, and they were pictures of his life in Germany. And they emigrated to this country in the 1930s, just prior to World War II. And I said, "Franz, hier ist Ihre Mutter. Hier ist Ihren Vater. Here is your mother. Here is your father." And he went quiet. And through the fog of that dementia, a tear rolled down that man's cheek. The context of his life. You have one, and I have one. When I was in graduate school, I was taught that contextualization, is everything. You can chat with Pastor Troy about this because he knows all about these things, the higher critical historical method, redaction methodology, and they're doing a lot of that in Washington, D.C. right now. Here's the document we do. We don't want you to read the whole thing, so half of it is blackened out. That's called redaction methodology, if you will. And then there's literary criticism. Blah, 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 blah. But contextualization, well, it's the who, what, when, why, and how of Scripture. Now, don't get me wrong. There's value and usefulness within contextual criticism. But context, the context of your life for